our little recording. So I guess when I start recording, I guess that's the official start. Good afternoon for a Thursday afternoon. 'Tis lovely out. Happy fall. Today we're going to finish up the 19th century. Cover all the things that happened and all the new technologies and where that led society. Next week, test week, I will do a review on Tuesday. And just like we do before, it's open book, open note, and that'll be that. So you'll have your, you'll have that next week. And there will be no class next Thursday because you can use that time to take the test. So that's what's up. So, and then we get to the 20th century and we finish up the class. So I do appreciate all of that. Again, I did finish grading this morning all the essays. Those who missed some things here or there were like, people just write one long paragraph. You know, we need to break essays into a couple of paragraphs at least. The biggest thing is you talk about, the internet and 8 different effects when you should focus on one and give examples. Things like that. We will have one more essay, at least, maybe 2. One more essay, and I'll probably come up with something on the election and the media, because we will see, you know, because we'll be starting to talk about ethics and the media coverage and whether or not our media has been ethical, and Lord knows there have been issues. So that'll probably be after the test. We'll talk about ethics, and we have a big election coming up. So I'm trying to make this relevant. So that's up and coming, test next week, and we will move on. The thing with the 19th century at this point is, last time we talked about some of the big technologies. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the environment that the media was in during this time, because we talked about the telephone and the telegraph and the phonograph and all of these new things that went on. All of a sudden you go from, and the high-speed press. All of these things at the beginning of the 19th century, people are mostly living on farms. They're not getting a lot of communication. And then you get plugged in with the telegraph. And then you get pictures. And then you get the high-speed press. So you're getting messages and reading and all of that. And during the Civil War, the Union really used that ability to coordinate its things and make a difference. And after the war, again, we have more technology. This is the telephone, and a lot of immigrants coming in. All of a sudden, media is getting big. And when it gets big, people start worrying about the effects. And at this time, after the Civil War, One thing people never even thought about are media ethics. So you have this big thing, and no, which could do anything it wants because we have free speech. So it is a period we called yellow journalism. And we'll talk a little about that. Yellow journalism may even have started a war. William Randolph Hearst said, "You give me the story and I'll give you a war." And he did.
It has been written that the pen is mightier than the sword. Perhaps it's because the pen has the ability to summon the sword. Colonial newspapers filled with opinion pieces written by the likes of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine helped mobilize Americans for the Revolutionary War. The American media would rapidly evolve from these small localized chains to become a multi-million-dollar business equivalent to millions of pens. Through the newspapers the printing press turned out, the world got its first taste of mass media. For William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer,
just want to show you, we call it yellow journalism, based on this cartoon character, the Yellow Kid. He was just kind of, I don't know if you remember Mad Magazine, Alfred E. Newman, what me worry, just this silly thing. Journalism was silly. And that was the idea of yellow journalism.
And Joseph Pulitzer, mass media meant mass profit. The circulation war between these two men demonstrated that the media leads the nation, for better or for worse. Pulitzer and Hearst would leave a legacy in blood and ink and show how war can be brought from print to presence. Joseph Pulitzer was born in Mako, Hungary on April 10, 1847. After gaining American citizenship in the Civil War, Pulitzer moved to Missouri, where he would take over the Vestal Post and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Pulitzer took the profits from these papers and, with the help of his brother Albert Pulitzer, purchased the New York World from railroad baron Jay Gould in 1883. The World quickly rose to prominence by securing the election of Grover Cleveland in 1884. New York was a swing state that would decide the election, and as Pulitzer biographer James Morris would write, electing Cleveland and boosting circulation were completely intertwined, the latter increasing the former. Pulitzer put his aggressive style of journalism on display through the political assassination of Republican candidate James Blaine. He explained his philosophy by writing, "The most valuable and successful paper will generally be that which has the most enemies." Pulitzer would use his vicious muckraking to make the world the most widely circulated newspaper in America. William Randolph Hearst was born on April 29, 1863, to U.S. Senator George Hearst. Pulitzer's success at the New York World inspired Hearst to drop out of college and take over the San Francisco Examiner from his father, giving it the title the Monarch of Dailies. Hearst quickly moved to acquire the greatest talents of his time, including Ambrose Bierce, Mark Twain, Jack London, and political cartoonist Homer Davenport. In 1895, Albert Pulitzer refused to sell the New York Morning Journal to his brother, instead opting to sell his paper to Hearst, who renamed it simply the New York Journal. The circulation war between Hearst and Pulitzer was ultimately a contest between competing philosophies.
Hearst believed in journalism of action. So he thought that the newspaper itself should bring about social change and social action in very concrete ways. Pulitzer sort of believed that too, but not the sort of inserting the newspaper into stories. Pulitzer's paper is doing some hardcore investigative work. So, his paper not only investigates that, but they make it into a crusade. They beat that story each and every day like a drum until there's change.
With that, the stage was set for the bitter birth of yellow journalism. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1888, both papers immediately jumped to treachery. For a week following the sinking, the Maine, Hearst even went so far as to announce a $50,000 reward for information leading to the apprehension of the perpetrators of the bombing. While the world was not at...
And you know who blew up the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor? Bunch of sailors sitting on the deck, rolling their own, and some sparks got into the gunpowder, boom. And did it matter? No. What mattered is we have an excuse to attack those terrible Cubans, those terrible Spanish people in Cuba. And we went to the Spanish-American War just because just because essentially Hearst said, we'll give you a war.
As outlandish as the journal, it too pointed the finger at Spain and had numerous articles alleging treachery on the part of the Spanish. All of this
Was
led
not
the American
true.
people to call to war with the motto of "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." 2 months later, President William McKinley convinced Congress to declare war. The wartime reporting proved to be just as sensational as the antebellum, creating one of the most famous myths in American history, the myth of the Rough Riders. Articles on the Battle of San Juan Hill depicted Roosevelt and his riders as heroes who helped take San Juan Hill, leading to many misconceptions. The Rough Riders were nicknamed Woods Weary Walkers because of their status as more of an infantry troop than a cavalry outfit. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders actually fought on Kettle Hill and suffered heavy casualties. In fact, it was the 24th and 25th Colored Infantry units who were responsible for the victory because their covering fire prevented the Rough Riders from being totally annihilated. Regardless of these facts, Roosevelt's Rough Riders were hailed as heroes, and the groundwork for Roosevelt's political career had been laid. While it is true that both papers exaggerated America's military dominance, the war truly was a crushing defeat to Spain. America's Navy, thanks to advanced technology, crushed the Spanish Armada in Cuba. At the Battle of Manila Bay, Commodore George Dewey's Asiatic Squadron completely annihilated the Spanish Pacific Squadron, ending the fight for the Philippines. Hearst's journalism in action ultimately...
Yep, and we defeated them in the Philippines. And we owned the Philippines and we owned Cuba for a while.
Tested Pulitzer's investigative method in wartime coverage. Hearst would break Cuban freedom fighter Evangelina Cisneros out of a Spanish prison camp, and even go so far as to make plans to personally fund a blockade of the Suez Canal. The Journal boldly asked, "How do you like the Journal's war?" And indeed, the Journal had overtaken the world as America's most read newspaper. Unfortunately, a much bloodier war would soon dominate the headlines. On February 4th, 1899, fighting broke out in what would be known as the Second Battle of Manila. 15,000 Filipinos sought to take Manila from an American occupying force of 19,000. The outmanned, outgunned Filipinos lost the battle with heavy casualties. On June 2nd, the First Philippine Republic declared war on the United States. It is at this point that most high school history textbooks quit talking about Hearst, Pulitzer, and yellow journalism. But this is a serious mistake. The Philippine-American War would not have occurred without the Spanish-American War that the World and the Journal brought from print to presence. Yellow journalism did not stop. The World published an article on January 22, 1889, claiming that Private Lapierre, an American soldier, had been infected with leprosy by the Filipino forces. Historians believe this account is false, and that Lapierre the leper was a pun for a sensational headline. Torture was commonly employed by American soldiers. A Senate committee reported that in one instance, a method of torture known as the water cure killed 134 out of 160 natives it was administered to. Both papers depicted the Filipinos as savage, even animal-like, in their racist artistic renderings while ignoring American atrocities. Thanks to the newspaper's blessings, Roosevelt became popular enough to become vice president. After William McKinley's death, Roosevelt used brute force to end the war, killing 220,000 Filipinos in the process. As the World and the Journal praised Roosevelt, they were ultimately praising his militarism. Pulitzer and Hearst both made a killing off the killing overseas, setting a dangerous precedent for generations to come. Instead of peace being the default setting of American foreign policy, intervention became the norm. Citizen Kane, a film inspired by Hearst, explains this trend best.
You provide the prose poems, I'll provide the war.
In the case of World War II, Roosevelt's militarism may have inadvertently caused the war. The thesis that Roosevelt inspired Japanese imperialism is most famously argued by James Bradley in The Imperial Cruise, and asserts that Roosevelt sanctioned Japan's acquisition of Korea and advised the Japanese as Aryans of the East to seek empire. Roosevelt urged Japan to establish Monroe Doctrine-like policies, and even stated, "I should like to see Japan have Korea." The impact of this historic advice would not be felt until the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. For Joseph Pulitzer, his legacy remains mostly a positive one. Pulitzer restored his legacy as a journalist of integrity during the construction of the Panama Canal. The World alleged that the $40 million allocated to buy land from the French ended up being pocketed by the main lobbies for the project, William Cromwell. Roosevelt decided...
Okay, you get the idea. The media is telling people, oh, America is a big, powerful country, and we're just as good as anybody else, and we should go to war against the Spanish and take what is ours. And that kind of argument has been with us today. How much should we be involved in?
Booking a family vacation in a Verbo means leaving all the craziness behind. Well, maybe not all of it. Crazy feels good when it has room to spread out in a vacation home on the beach with a pool.
By 1897, Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal have solved the jigsaw murder mystery. And they've done so by breaking traditional rules and bending ethics.
So they had a lot of influence. They had a lot of power.
Now Hearst turns his attention back to Cuba and finds the perfect story in Evangelina Cisneros. She is educated, refined, and unmistakably beautiful.
Hearst's newspaper said that she's guilty of only having the best blood in Cuba in her veins. Otherwise, she's an innocent victim of the Cuban rebellion.
And Hearst makes the most of her story.
It's a damsel in distress story made for newspapers.
Hearst smartly uses the storyline as a symbol for Cuban oppression under Spanish colonial rule.
So what Hearst does is send to Cuba a guy named Carl Decker. Decker was in the Washington, D.C. bureau of the New York Journal. And he goes there ostensibly as the journal's man in Havana.
Decker secures a room across from the prison where Cisneros is being held.
Decker's secret instructions are to find a way to break Evangelina Cisneros out of jail and get her to the United States safely.
Decker and his accomplices, who were able to pass instructions to Evangelina, set out in the dead of night. They cross between buildings and scale the prison walls. Hearst's plan is a flagrant crossing of a journalistic line. He is now in the business of creating and directly influencing the story. Meanwhile, Evangelina, who is in on the plan, drugs her cellmate, then ties a white cloth to the window bars to signal Decker. Decker finally arrives, risking his life to create a fairy tale rescue that Hearst knows will resonate with Americans.
And they break the bars without any problem. And then smuggle her out across the moonlit rooftop of the jail, across a very creaky plank connecting it to another building. Evangelina Cisneros has been broken out of jail and then, dressed as a boy, is escorted aboard a passenger steamer, American-flagged passenger steamer, headed to New York City.
So they're starting to make stories to sell papers. Show you another one just leaps to mind. Okay. Another thing you read about in the press that starts to come up.
During and after the American Civil War, people become more interested in the family lives of American presidents. And certainly one of the most notable examples of this happens in 1884, where reporters talk about the probability that Grover Cleveland fathered a child out of wedlock.
In 1873, Grover was a bachelor, and he was infatuated with a very attractive woman named Maria Halpin. Around Christmas of 1873, they happened to encounter each other on a street in Buffalo. They had a nice dinner, and Grover Cleveland was escorting her back to her boarding house. Maria later alleged Grover Cleveland sexually assaulted her. He attacked her, and against her will, they had sex. 6 weeks later, she realized that she was pregnant. Grover was flabbergasted, obviously very upset.
One of the great campaign slogans and songs from political history, 1884. Ma, ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. Yes, some things never change.
Upset. She demanded that he marry her. It got to the point where Cleveland, using his political influence his money and his power in Buffalo, arranged to have Maria Halpin committed into an insane asylum. At the same time, he arranged to have his biological son sent to an orphanage.
Now, the truth of the matter was that Cleveland may not have been the father. Maria was apparently perhaps somewhat generous in distributing her affections. But Cleveland had been the only bachelor among them. And so he had done the right thing. He had claimed paternity so that nobody's marriage would be broken up. It says something about him that the last words on his deathbed would be, "I have tried so hard to do right." That's not saying I've done right. It's suggesting a sense that you failed, but you've tried.
My point is, and I do have one, that you have sex scandals, and it's in all the papers, and it's becoming...
Okay, well, let's do, I think Grover Cleveland has it, huh? Any serious dispute about that? Would you like to take an actual vote? You.
Okay, that was the next Grover Cleveland video. But yeah, he, you know, that was in all the media. So you have politics, you have sex, and nobody cares. So, so I mean, this is what's happening, and people are reading the media. Some things never change. I mentioned briefly in one of the earlier ones, Teddy Roosevelt, another big media history hero. See that picture there? It's a lie. He walked up San Juan Hill, but this is what you see in all the papers. And who really, he walked up and he got shot at, and it was the African-American troops who saved his butt. But he knew how to play the media. So he put that picture in all the newspapers, and the wars need a hero. There's Teddy Roosevelt, rides right up to become vice president of the United States and then president. Again, a lot happens because of the media. They talked about Cisneros. Hearst sent Nellie Bly around the world in 80 days. She did it in 72. And then also what's starting to happen, pictures. The newspapers start to print photos. If you remember, in the past, you'd have to take a picture and go to a gallery and see it personally. You couldn't get them printed. Well, the New York Daily Graphic figured out how to put pictures in print. And this is how first ever newspaper picture. There are people living in that pile of trash in New York City. You could talk about it, but you start reading it. So we have politics, we have sex, but we're also seeing some real documentary things.
In October 1890, a curious volume went on sale in the bookstores of New York. Called How the Other Half Lives, it had been written by a 41-year-old Danish-born police reporter named Jacob Riis. It would change forever the way people thought about the city. Riis had come to New York in 1870, when he was just 21, with $40 in his pocket. The money soon ran out, and he had learned firsthand what immigrant life could be like in the sprawling metropolis. Homeless, often hungry, and out of work, he had drifted into the crime-infested world of the 5 Points slum, dozing on the cold, filthy floors of police lodging houses. More than once, he considered killing himself. Eventually, he landed on his feet and managed to find work as a police reporter for the New York Tribune, and spent the next 10 years exploring the densely crowded slums of the Lower East Side. The sights, he later said, gripped my heart until I felt that I must tell of them or burst. Determined to show the world what he had seen, Rees began publishing magazine articles, but they seemed to make no impression, he wrote.
Mm-hmm. What makes a
He
difference?
thought of taking pictures, but the tenements were too dark for the photographs to come out. Then, in 1887, a breakthrough came with the invention of a new photographic device, a magnesium flash powder that flooded even the deepest shadow with a brilliant flash of light. Armed with the new apparatus, Rees and his assistants plunged into the 5 Points.
With their way illuminated by spasmodic flashes, as bright and brief as those of lightning itself, a mysterious party has lately been startling the town. Denizens of the dives, tramps and bummers in their lodgings, have marveled at the phenomenon. What they saw was 3 or 4 figures in the gloom, a ghostly tripod, some weird and uncanny movements, the blinding flash, and then the patter of retreating footsteps, and the mysterious visitors were gone. The New York Sun, February 12th, 1888.
They would go into places, especially at night, with the brand new flash powder attachment and surprise people, sleepers in these kind of collective sleeping rooms, or drinkers in these rot gut saloons.
The images Rees brought back brought wealthy and middle-class New Yorkers face to face with a reality most had long sought to avoid. Their city, one of the wealthiest in the world, had become home to more than 1 million overworked and undernourished people, often living in conditions of unspeakable horror. He went everywhere, carrying his camera down obscure courtyards and back ways, with names like Ragpicker's Row, Blind Man's Alley, and Bottled Alley. In a place called Bandit's Roost, he photographed a dozen men, all said to be wanted for murder. He was especially moved by the plight of the young, the ragged street Arabs, who sold newspapers by day and slept in alleys by night. The child laborers, who often worked 7 days a week in stifling factories and sweatshops. And the tens of thousands of abandoned and orphaned children who had been left to fend for themselves. But what horrified him most was the unspeakable conditions in which so many New Yorkers were forced to live.
You have a vast influx of new immigrant groups. So that whereas in 1860 it was essentially a city of small homes, by 1900, the most crowded neighborhoods in the world are in New York City, especially on the Lower East Side, but also in East Harlem. We have the rise of tenement housing. It's really worse than anything that was ever seen in the United States. And it's probably about as bad as anything that's ever been put up anywhere in the world.
A tenement, briefly defined, is simply a building that concentrates as many people into as little space as possible, with the lowest overhead costs for the landlord. The tenements began sometime in the middle of the 19th century, and there were no laws governing the tenement. So it really stuffed people into 6 or 7 floors of rickety walk-up, jammed into as many rooms as possible, many of which were interior rooms with no light of any sort or air.
I went up the dark stairs in one of those tenements, and there I trod upon a baby. It is the regular means of introduction in the old dark houses, but I was never able to get used to it. I photographed the baby, standing with its back against the public sink, in a pool of filth that overflowed on the floor. I do not marvel that 1 in 5 children in the rear tenement, into which the sunlight never comes, was killed by the house. It seemed strange, rather. And then he survived. Jacob Reese.
Many of the tenements were life-threatening, literally. That is to say that the threat of disease, infectious bacterial diseases like dysentery, for example, was always there, and epidemics could spread rapidly. The high death rate, the high sickness rate. This was the reality for many, many hundreds of thousands, millions of New Yorkers in any given moment.
Ill-fed and ill-clothed, packed into buildings with few sinks or toilets, and sometimes with no plumbing at all. Tenement dwellers were prey to every kind of disease: diphtheria, influenza, typhoid, pneumonia. Worst of all was the disease called the White Plague, tuberculosis. Every year, 20,000 new cases were reported in the slums. Every year, 8,000 people died of the disease.
Including my grandfather.
July and August spell death to the army of little ones, whom the doctor's skill is powerless to save. Sleepless mothers walk the street in the gray of the early dawn, trying to stir a cooling breeze to fan the brow of the sick baby. There is no sadder sight than this patient devotion against fearfully hopeless odds. Little coffins are stacked mountains of the Charity Commissioner's boat when it makes its semi-weekly trip to the city cemetery. Jacob Reese.
How the Other Half Lives awakened New Yorkers to the condition of the poor, as nothing else had. It was a new way of seeing the world, a modern way. And Reese used it not only to underscore his outrage, but to spur people to action. The slums were not inevitable, he insisted. They had been built by men and men women could change them.
One of the things that Reese is trying to do in this book, I think, is to get away from some of the older Victorian notions of poverty. Why are some people poor? Why do some people live in such terrible conditions? And his answer is more along the lines of a modern sort of environmental view of poverty. What he's basically arguing is that if people are going to live in these terrible tenements, if people are going to be deprived of the basics of light and air and decency, we can't be surprised if these people become criminals or depraved or alcoholics or what have you. So that there's a way in which Reese is, I think, the opening shot, if you will, or you know, the first chapter in a Reformed tradition. Because it was a book that made a lot of people want to get involved in improving life in the city.
Not long after the book was published, New York's energetic young civil service commissioner, Theodore Roosevelt, called on Reese at his office on Printing House Square. The writer was out, but Roosevelt left his calling card with a note on the back. "I have read your book," it said, "and I have come to help."
Yes. And what does
Many people
Roosevelt
think of
do
the
10
Lower East
years
Side
later?
as a place for hipsters, cool restaurants, and
Yeah,
bars.
and there is, it's now where all the hipsters live. But now, okay. After that, you have child labor laws. You have the 7-day work week or 5-day work week, the 40-hour week, minimum wage, after people see that, all of that. But getting back to ethics and bias, was Reese biased? And what was his bias? Well, you know what the bias is. He doesn't like how the poor people are treated. What's the other side of that argument, and why is that relevant today? How do you fix poverty?
Employment.
You fix poverty by giving these people
employment,
opportunities, maybe welfare. food, housing. What that does, it raises taxes. And should my taxes go up to help those people? It's the same question we're facing today. Reese had one side of it. He didn't try to hear the other side of it. Plus, if you have minimum occupancy, you don't cram people into the rent goes up. These are the other sides of these arguments that we're having today. Is it my or your responsibility, your family's responsibility to pay more taxes to help those people? I'm not going to answer that one for you. I mean, but those are the issues we have today. And yes, everybody, Hearst and Pulitzer were biased. Reese was biased. You have the Grover Cleveland scandal, and you have Teddy Roosevelt managing his image all the way to the presidency. All modern stuff. Where does ethics come in? It doesn't. Nobody cares. It does start to matter in the 20th century, and that's why I break this up where I do. So that's where we'll end this unit. They got a blank on their extra credit. If there's something missing, email me and I'll fix it. And I'll write that there.
We've got less ethics today in media with the companies Google, Facebook, Snapchat, competing, selling human futures. The marketing is human futures, you know?
Yep, that's true.
There's no ethics in that.
No, there is no, and that is one of the later essays that if we do a last essay, that's what I ask about. What is their responsibility? What is Facebook would say it's not a medium. It doesn't have to have these, its ideas, it's open that anybody can say whatever and Facebook won't judge.
It's also not free.
Yeah, that's where we were though 120 years ago. Anybody could say anything and nobody cared. And this whole idea about journalism and media ethics kind of came and maybe is going. So again, media ethics did not matter until the 20th century. That's kind of the takeaway from today. And everybody was all over the place. Other questions? If anyone's having trouble with the extra credit, I did post it. And I know you're doing it. If you're having a problem, if it's not giving you the stuff, I will review it and make sure you're taken care of.
You said it is already posted. I think someone said it wasn't popping up on theirs.
The extra credit? I posted it just at the beginning of class.
Oh, okay. We probably just got to refresh our page and check again.
Sit through class first. It's an incentive to sit through class. So anyway.
Gotcha.
All right. So that's kind of the point. All right. Any other stuff? Okay. Have a lovely afternoon. And
Have a good one.
see you next time.
Bye-bye.